Order. John Trickett to move the motion.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Efford. I'm looking forward to speaking and to this debate under your chairpersonship. I'm sure you'll be fair but firm, fair with us and firm with the other side. Now, we're meeting today on what I regard as a very, very serious issue, and it's good to see so many people all well brushed and shaved and whatever else, toothbrushes and all the other things one does in the morning. Hope you all had a good breakfast. It's great to see you all here. This is a serious debate with a serious underlying problem which affects millions of people, as we'll hear. And we are meeting today with a weather forecast, at least in my patch in Yorkshire, God's own country as we call it, at -1 at the weekend. And therefore with great problems for those people who are living in fuel poverty. And I say that because I want to just share one thing with the House from my own personal experience, which is that I grew up as a child in a property which was later condemned as a slum and was demolished. And I remember me and my brother living in an unheated house. There was no heating at all, apart from one coal fire. And in winter, it was perishing. And it's left me with an enduring feeling that people living in the conditions which I saw should be better supported by a society which claims to be the 6th wealthiest in the world. And it's with that background that I want to speak briefly about the fuel poverty in England. Now, let me say another thing, preparatory thing, which is the incoming government, although it's been here for some time now, did face the most difficult inheritance in dealing with fuel poverty and with all of the other fiscal problems which we've heard much about. And it was welcome to see the announcement on last week that the government is addressing some issues on fuel poverty. I just have one question about the government's proposals for private landlords. We know that many tenants of private landlords are living in fuel poverty because the properties which are being rented are not properly thermally insulated. Now, the government has now said that private landlords must bring their properties up to standard, but the fear is in some people's minds that the landlords will simply use it as an excuse to further bump up the rents with an excuse that they've had to pay to make the properties more efficient. But they chose to rent out properties knowing that the properties weren't properly efficient. And I can understand when tenants say to me and to other people too that this is not right. Now, when the government made its decision on winter fuel allowance, I received around about 1,000 emails. And those emails, many cases, were heartbreaking. Now, it's not often the case that the voices of ordinary folk get heard in this place, as we know. And I just want to refer to 3 or 4, very, very briefly, comments which I received out of the 1,000. I received an email from somebody who has something called post-polio syndrome. They had polio as a child. A person with that syndrome finds it very difficult to keep warm. And as a result, I then spoke to them and we said, well, look, it's possible to go into one of the local community or church halls, which every single village in my constituency now have, in order to keep warm. But the response was, that's fine, but I've got to keep the house warm in any event, because when I go back into a cold home, I've got this problem with the syndrome. Had another communication from somebody with asthma. He's managed to keep it under control for most of the years, but he caught the bug. It took him more than a month to shake the bug off. He was struggling really with the asthma. Couldn't get warm at all in spite of wrapping himself in blankets. He tells me the house that he lives in has a roof which is more than 70 years old. He keeps on getting it patched up with the help of his family because he has no money. He can't afford a new one and he can't get help from anybody. The insurance company says it's wear and tear, so they won't help to pay for the roof. All the heating is putting on is escaping straight into the atmosphere. And then I had a letter from a lady in Normanton her total income is £221 a week. She's a pensioner. And the amount of money she's paying in rent, mortgage, and in mortgage, I should say, and also in the tax she pays to the council tax, these are only £50 a week. She earns 221. The total amount of money outgoing for just those two items is 171. She's only left with £50 a week to pay for heating, food, and all the other necessities of life. How is that woman meant to survive under those circumstances?
Well, my friend give way on that point.
I will briefly.
Thank you. And I thank my honourable friend for giving way on that point and for securing this very important and timely debate. But does my honourable friend agree with me that it's shocking that nearly 80% of Liverpool Riverside residents have to spend nearly 10% of their disposable income on keeping their homes warm? And would you also agree with me that more targeted support is needed to enable local authorities to support those in most need in our constituencies?
I thank my honourable friend for her comments, and of course what she's saying is correct. What the lady I was just talking about told me, to live on £50 a week is practically impossible. I imagine there are some people around, even in this chamber, as modest as we all are, who spend more than £50 on a meal. And so think about a woman left in Normanton, in my constituency, with only that amount of money. And her final comments are poignant, and she speaks for the 1,000 people who wrote to me when she says, for many, retirement now means misery and making ends meet. And she says, in the future, no doubt, I will have a choice, which many already have, of either heating or eating. I'll be just another statistic, she says. It's not something which one should look forward to, having worked all our lives. And, of course, she speaks for millions of people in relation to the comment she just made. Now, let me come to the broader picture. I will give way, but briefly, we're trying to...
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way and for sharing some of those heartbreaking stories. A constituent of mine from Ilton wrote to me recently. She suffers with rheumatoid arthritis and needs a warm environment to keep warm. But because she is on PIPs, she's not eligible to claim the winter fuel allowance. So does the honourable member agree with me that the government must urgently reassess their exemptions to the winter fuel allowance to ensure that those who are in medical need receive the financial support that they require?
Well, the honourable lady's made a point, and I think the House probably knows my views on winter fuel, but I better move on before I get myself into trouble. 1 in 4 people, households in my constituency in Fitzwilliam and Kinsley, who were miners, providing the heat for our country, are now living in fuel poverty as a result of the changes which have happened in the last few years. The overall picture in England alone is there are 2 definitions of fuel poverty. The first is the government rule, which was changed under the Tory government in 2015. They estimate 3 million households in England. But that definition means you've got to both be in poverty, but also your house has got to be inadequately insulated. But there are many people who... I'm not going to take any more because there's so many people wanting to speak. But there are so many people who are in poverty, whose house is thermally insulated, but still remain in poverty. But they're excluded from the 3 million figure. So a more accurate figure is the one which takes account of only the fact that you're living in fuel poverty. And that suggests, in England alone, 8.9 million households living in fuel poverty. Now, if we say, let's say 2 persons per household, we're talking about 17 or 18 million people waking up in the morning in an unheated house, like I did, living in the attic with my brother, with ice on the inside of the windows. And it's unbearable to think about that in one of the richest countries in the world. Ill health is a direct consequence of inadequately heated houses. According to whichever figure you use, between 10 and 20% of all the excess winter deaths which occur in England are caused by unheated or cold houses. It is a disgrace that that should be the case. And in children living in a cold home, 1 in 4 suffer from mental health problems. I'm not surprised because of the conditions which they're living in. Now, let me turn quickly to the causes. And we could debate this for a long time, but there are 2 separate issues, it seems to me. One is the level of price which the energy companies are charging, which is driven by profits and greed, frankly, and the other one is poor insulation. I'm going to leave it to other members, perhaps, to speak about the impact of uninsulated houses on the climate, because there isn't time to say everything. But on prices, between 2022 and 2023, it is a scandal that the price of energy increased by 27%, leaving another almost 250,000 households in fuel poverty. And I noticed the other day when the Bank of England decided it was going to cut the interest by 25 points, they added a comment which was to say that they expect inflation to increase because of rising energy prices. That is a disastrous position for so many people in our country and will drive more people into fuel poverty. So let me just quote the campaign group, which represents 60 different charities, warned this winter. What they said, and they're authoritative, is there's clearly an obscene level of profits being made by the energy suppliers. But I think the whole of the energy industry needs to be looked at, from extraction through to the providers. End Fuel Poverty Coalition said, while consumers have suffered in cold, damp homes this winter, energy firms' boardrooms have been celebrating further bumper profits. I don't see how that's acceptable in a society which claims to be one of the richest in the world, but there we are. On the question of the building stock itself, and I'm a builder by trade. I was a heating engineer and plumber and worked in the building industry. It is shocking that there are still people out of work with building skills, that the building stock of our country is so poorly thermally insulated. Almost just over 40% of all houses and flats and residences in Britain don't meet the minimum standards which the government requires. The implication on the planet is clear, others may want to talk about it. Now, the government inherited a number of programmes to try to tackle the issue of fuel poverty, but the previous government had moved on to a situation of providing smart meters. Now, smart meters are useful in terms of you being able to control or to see how much energy you are consuming, but it doesn't help to keep your house warm. And I think that government initiative by the Conservative Party basically distracted people from the real problem of trying to tackle low income and high energy costs, driven, as I've said, by profit seeking. There were 3 programmes which were in place. The energy company obligation. There was an obligation on energy companies to begin to tackle the problem. But it started off well in 2020, 113 houses. But by last year, it had gone down to 38,000 houses, I think I'm right in saying. A collapse, really, in the work which the energy companies, who were taking all that money out of the tenants and the residents, then really failed to deliver. Secondly, there's a programme called Warm Homes Discount. It only applies to 11% of the population in England. And so only 50% of all those houses which need attention have been fully insulated. So that's where we are today. I do think it's a scandal. I do think it's wrong morally, economically, financially, in any way you can imagine, that people who perhaps who worked all their lives, who are now pensioners, had a reasonable prospect of living a satisfactory life, are living in homes which are poorly heated, children, often in homes where there's at least one adult working on low pay, because that's another problem. The fact that their bosses are paying low pay increasingly to people, that those numbers of people, those numbers of houses ought to have been left in the condition that they are. And I do feel, and I'm hoping when the Minister replies, she can give us some confidence that we are going somewhere. And as I've said, it takes time for the government to begin to turn the direction, but we do need to move fast. So let me just pose 3 questions finally to the Minister, where I'm pleased to see in a place. The first is, where is the government going on fuel poverty? Is it a high priority? Secondly, what is she going to do about the energy company obligation, which is failing? And finally, one thing which is quite important, has been often discussed, is the social tariff. The idea that the energy companies should have a social tariff for the lowest paid and those with most difficulty. Now, extraordinarily, the country's decided there should be a social tariff for use of the internet. You can be paying less for the internet if you're living in a difficult situation. It's extraordinary that we don't have a social tariff for energy production. So, is there, and I believe that there's a consultation ongoing at the moment on the question of social tariff. Could the Minister, in her reply, if she has time, tell the House exactly where we're going in relation to that matter too? There's much more to say, but there are quite a number of members here wanting to speak, so I'll draw my comments to a conclusion, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much.
Members, to Bob in your place, you will only get called if you are standing. It does allow us to plan ahead and make sure we can get everybody in. Can I also say that because there are so many of you wanting to speak, we're going to have an informal time limit of 5 minutes. We will put the clock on so that you can follow it when you're on your feet. The question is that the House has considered fuel poverty in England. Any chance?
Thank you, Mr. Efford. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I thank the honourable member for calling this debate, which is indeed important and very timely. I'd also like to thank all of the constituents who have written to me to share their concerns about fuel poverty, not just knowing that this debate is coming up today, but in fact over months and months, particularly in relation to the winter fuel payment, and I will come on to that later. But I want to start by just drawing the attention of the House to the fact that this is an incredibly important issue in my constituency in particular. I'll share with the House some statistics that I've just checked. So on the latest data, 22.9% of households in my constituency of North Herefordshire live in fuel poverty. That is far higher than the national average of 14.4%. That's according to the government's low-income, low-energy efficiency measure. Now, that's... As the measure says, fuel poverty is due to both lower income and problems in the property, the lack of energy efficiency in the property, and indeed high fuel prices, as the honourable member has said. And in my constituency of North Herefordshire, nearly double the number of houses compared to the national average are detached houses. We've got a far lower proportion of houses that are on mains energy supply. All of these make it a particular issue in a rural constituency like North Herefordshire. Also, we have a far higher proportion of over 65s in my constituency, half as many again as the national average. All of these are contributory factors and mean that fuel poverty is an incredibly kind of real and presenting issue in my constituency. And I was just reviewing some of the emails that constituents have sent me in recent days, weeks and months, where they've talked about living with only one radiator on, the fact that no winter fuel allowance means they can no longer buy any coal for the winter. We still have constituents whose only source of heating is coal in my constituency. Very briefly.
I'm very grateful for her for giving way. I, like her, represent a rural constituency where over double the national average of residents use heating oil and gas. Would you give comment to how we can go about transitioning those residents to more sustainable and cheaper sources of fuel?
I thank the honourable member, and I absolutely do plan to comment on precisely that topic. So it's a huge... But I was telling the stories of my constituents. A lady who wrote to me saying, you know, she lives wrapped in blankets now. Constituents who have shared with me their particular needs relating to their ill health, their health conditions, and just how damaging it is not to be able to afford to keep warm. Now, the honourable member who brought this debate talked about the outrageous profits made by the energy companies, and I share his extreme frustration and distress at that situation. It is an area where I think the government could go even further in ensuring that we are not seeing essentially price gouging, where constituents struggling in fuel poverty are the ones who are basically bearing the costs. And at the same time, these big energy companies are making profits in the billions each year. Absolutely extraordinary.
On that point, will the honourable member give way?
Very briefly.
I thank the honourable member. Far be it from me to intrude on the grief of elected members in England and their constituents, but this is Westminster, which is currently responsible for energy laws across the UK. While devolved governments have a role to play in reducing fuel poverty, the biggest levers of change, surely the honourable member would agree, are in the remit of the UK government, such as the coupling of electricity prices, which are increasingly generated here on this island with the global gas market, and the nonsensical decision to cut the winter fuel payment, and the ongoing failure of this government to reduce fuel bills. They're going up for the third time since July.
I thank the honourable member for his comments, and I agree with him that we must see the decoupling of electricity prices from gas, which currently contributes to the problems that people face. Now, we've established that the problem of energy poverty, fuel poverty, is related in part to prices, and government does have levers to control those, but also to government policies. And in particular, I'd like to talk about three areas: targeted support to households in fuel poverty, insulation policies, how we deal with the housing stock that we already have, and how we ensure that future housing is future-proofed so that nobody who moves into a new house has to pay through the nose for their energy. So just briefly on targeted support, I have spoken previously a number of times in this House to criticise the government's nonsensical decision to completely cancel the winter fuel allowance for all except a small number of people. There are very large numbers of people in my constituency who have written to me, who still do, expressing their great distress at the impact that this has had on them. I cannot urge the government too strongly to reconsider, to ensure that next winter we don't have these thousands in my own constituency, tens of thousands, millions of people across the country who are facing increased fuel poverty because of the government's decision to stop the winter fuel allowance for so many who do still need it. We also need targeted support. I welcome the comments of the honourable member there on a social tariff, help to repay for those who are in energy debt as well. But to move on to the question, the fundamental structural question of the quality of our housing, essentially the problem is that our homes leak heat. People are paying money for energy, which is going out the windows, up the chimney, out of the roof. It's a total waste. What is the government going to do to tackle this? The previous government destroyed the energy efficiency programmes. We need a nationwide, house-by-house, street-by-street home insulation programme to ensure that the energy that people buy stays in their homes. I really hope that the Minister will be able to make some concrete commitments to go further and faster to insulate homes. And lastly, new homes must be built to the most highest possible energy efficiency standards. If the cheapest time to insulate a home is at the point of construction, why are we not ensuring that all new homes are built to zero carbon standards to ensure that all of the heat in the home stays in it? Thank you.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, and thank you to the honourable member for Normanton and Hemsworth again for securing this important debate today. I know that all of us on every side of the House would agree that this is a topic which matters enormously to our constituents. In my constituency in Mansfield, 1 in 6 households live in fuel poverty. This is almost 10,000 households, higher than the average for the East Midlands and considerably higher than the national average. And although energy costs have fallen from the extraordinary highs that we saw in 2022, the price cap remains very high for my constituents. And in my constituency, families with children are more than twice as likely to be in fuel stress compared to pensioner households, while lone parents households are 3 times as likely. So I think the government must recognise this, and I am pleased that they're currently reviewing the fuel poverty strategy for England to help everyone, whether they're pensioners or families or people living alone, to help them keep warm. And I therefore welcome also that the new government's taking decisive action to help reduce bills in the longer term. This includes the government's Warm Homes Plan, providing funding to enable properties, including social landlords, to transition their housing stock to become decarbonised and more energy efficient. And I also want to take this opportunity to congratulate Mansfield District Council for all of the work that they're doing to retrofit existing properties, and the huge difference that I hear from my constituents that this makes to their fuel bills. But also I'd like to congratulate the Labour-controlled Mansfield District Council for building more eco-friendly, affordable family council homes in my constituency, such as those on the Bellamy Road development that I visited just last week. So I know that in the long term, Great British Energy will invest in clean power projects all across the country. This is the cheapest form of electricity generation, and it will help our country also become energy dependent and not as susceptible to huge swings in international energy prices. But I do agree with the Honourable Member for Hemsworth that we should look to encourage energy suppliers in the medium term to re-establish social tariffs. And I would say to the Minister, it's really important that we have this in place for next winter. These would help everyone in my constituency who's experiencing fuel stress to access cheaper energy, and it would have a real tangible impact for my constituents. But in the short term, I want to make the case for a substantial expansion of the cold weather payments scheme as a very efficient way to address the current reality of energy cost pressures in Mansfield. This offers a way for the government to provide pensioners with further payments in the event of a serious chill, while at the same time offering something to families who are not often part of this conversation. I think expanding the eligibility for households, either in receipt of a means-tested benefit or state pension or child benefit or disability benefits, would help the poorest families and non-pensioner households to receive support, and this would provide really vital economic security for families in my constituency. And I know that the government want to do more. I'm sure of that, and I look forward to hearing the government's response to the review in due course, and I hope that ministers could implement this ahead of next winter.
Before I call the next speaker, I'm going to have to bring it down to 4 minutes. I'm going to get everybody in by past. So, Dr. Brian Matthew.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Efford. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and thank you to the Honourable Member for securing this important debate. All of us here have heard heart-wrenching stories from our constituencies of families struggling to heat their homes. Vulnerable pensioners worried about staying warm in what has been a cold and damp winter. Nearly 5,000 households, or 11.3% of households in my constituency of Melksham and Devizes, are classified as being fuel poor or in fuel poverty, struggling to keep their homes warm, spending a very high proportion of their household income in order to heat their homes, or in living in energy inefficient homes that makes keeping warm incredibly difficult, with the choice of keeping warm or putting food on the table a real one. It's worth noting that just 1,372 pensioners are on pension credit in my constituency. That's 6% of the total number of pensioners, and it raises further questions about those who either didn't apply for pension credit, even though they may deserve it, or fall just outside the limit while they are actually in fuel poverty. In a first world, highly developed country, this is unacceptable. It's unacceptable that people in one of the richest nations of the world struggle to keep their homes warm in winter. Fuel poverty has impacts outside of energy policy. It affects people's physical and mental health. It adds demands to the NHS's winter crisis. We must tackle fuel poverty by looking both long-term and for immediate solutions. In the long term, we must look to retrofitting houses and homes to make them more energy efficient, insulating homes and installing heat pumps. Immediately, however, we must provide vulnerable households, like those in Melksham and Devizes, with more support to pay unaffordable energy bills. And we must see the restoration of the winter fuel allowance for all pensioners. Thank you.
Neil Duncan-Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Efford. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I also pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Northampton and Hemsworth, for securing this timely and important debate. According to National Energy Action, 1 in 10 households in my constituency of Poole live in fuel poverty, with the worst affected likely to be in low-income households, the unemployed, and of course pensioners. There's no doubt that fuel poverty is inextricably linked to financial poverty. For example, 1.8 million carers struggle with their fuel bills, and these are often the same people who also have to use food banks or cut back on food in order to pay for their gas and electricity. Many of these carers are themselves older, and as we know, the need to keep warmer for longer when we get older is essential. We become less active, more sedentary, and our blood circulation is poorer. That is why the decision to means test the winter fuel allowance was wrong and needs to be reversed. We know the DWP figures show that 880,000 older people were eligible for pension credit but did not claim it. Since the decision to means test the winter fuel payment, around 47,000 pensioners have now come forward to make a claim. But that, of course, leaves over 800,000 older people without a winter fuel payment that they previously would have received. And let's be under no illusions, these are among the very poorest pensioners in our society. There's considerable evidence as well to show that when a benefit is specifically named for a purpose, like a winter fuel payment, recipients are more likely to actually use it for that reason. They put it aside to pay the next bill that comes in. It comes in the winter because that's when the largest bills arrive, but for this group of pensioners, the bill came, but the winter fuel payment never showed up. Universal payments also reach the people who need it most, and it's a more efficient way to pay it to everyone and use the taxation system to redistribute to those from those wealthier pensioners who might not need the payment. According to the Carers Trust, at least 180,000 unpaid carers over the age of 65 will have been impacted negatively by the decision to means test the winter fuel allowance. This group is also shut out of many of the other support available from government. For example, eligibility for carers allowance does not qualify people for the warm home discount, and the discount is based on a property's type, age and floor area, not someone's actual bill. And likewise, an underlying entitlement to carers allowance does not qualify individuals for cold weather payments. The drive for clean energy transition is an opportunity to tackle the problem by lowering bills and insulating our homes. But the energy market and the role of private companies is broken. The obscene level of profits being made, mentioned by my honourable friend in his opening contribution, needs to be addressed. As a minimum first step, we need to see the introduction of social tariffs for low-income households to guarantee lower bills for those who need it. We also need to consider making assistance with fuel bills available as a form of social prescribing, so that health professionals who consider that there is a recognisable health benefit could enable patients to get cheaper fuel. And finally, we need to reverse the cruel decision to means test the winter fuel allowance. In one go, we reduce the support for 10 million pensioners. That needs to end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I thank the member for Normanton and Hemsworth for securing this important debate. And I agree with him that Yorkshire is very much God's own county, as one of the sole surviving Conservatives representing one of the West Yorkshire seats. Look, this is an incredibly important debate, and can I also thank many of the constituents that have kindly contacted me on this really important issue of fuel poverty, because like representing a northern town, there are specific challenges, not least to do with the old housing stock that we have, that most of which remains being poorly insulated, but also with the increasing fuel prices that all households are experiencing, and indeed when you represent particularly rural-based parts of the constituency, with most of those houses being off-grid, therefore experiencing higher energy prices. And 17.6% of those that live in Keighley are indeed in fuel poverty, many of whom are pensioners, who have been drastically impacted by this Labour government's decision to remove the winter fuel allowance. 64,000 pensioners across the Bradford district will be impacted right now over this winter period as a result of Labour's choice, Mr Chairman, to remove the winter fuel allowance. And that's not the only challenge that they face within the Bradford district, because the council has just requested a 15% increase in council tax, but yet the Deputy Prime Minister signed it off at 10%. So going forward, in this financial year, all of my constituents are going to be having to pay an extra 10% on top of that. Now, the opposite side may say this is because of 14 years, but this is a council that only in 2021 declared that they were in sound financial health in 2021 and have made the choice at a local level to waste up to £50 million of taxpayers' money on a music venue, Bradford Live, in the centre of Bradford, which is not even open yet. This is money that could be spent on better supporting those that are indeed in fuel poverty across the Bradford district. And I'm not the only one that is calling this government out. There are many in Keighley that are doing the same, including the coordinator of a social supermarket, the Good Food Shop in Keighley, which says that the move to increase council tax by 10% could push more of those that are coming to his shop, already struggling families and individuals, well below the breadline, and lead to a huge surge in demand for the services. They are indicating that the council and indeed the government, both of whom are controlled by the Labour Party, should be helping those that are struggling more, not wasting council tax money on city-based projects in the centre of Bradford that are not actually having any benefit to my constituents in Keighley. And indeed, the Salvation Army in Keighley is saying exactly the same thing. Major Imogen Stewart has also raised concerns around those in fuel poverty, indeed linking it to the challenges with the increase in council tax of 10%, saying that people are frightened to turn on their heating due to the increased costs which they are facing. Indeed, those costs, Mr Chairman, of winter fuel allowance also being removed, directly impacting those that are on fuel poverty. The Salvation Army indicates that those that are coming not now to use their food bank, but are actually asking for blankets, sleeping bags and warm clothes to keep them warm. And they are experiencing referrals increasing and fear that this will only get worse as time goes ahead. So Labour were elected on a promise of no tax rises for working people. They were elected on a promise to put their party back in the service of working people. But my constituents are not seeing that. Mr Chairman. They are seeing the exact opposite. So I say to the Minister, it's about time that this government does change track and puts working people at the heart of their policies going forward.
Mr Efford, and I congratulate my honourable friend for Normanton and Hemsworth on securing this important debate on a pressing issue that has plagued our society for too long. It's travesty that in a nation as prosperous as ours, more than 3 million, or if he's correct, perhaps 8.9 million, but at least 13.1% of households in England are struggling to keep their homes warm and their lights on. And in parts of Northwich, in my constituency, that number can go as high as 20%. These statistics not only show the scale of the problem, but highlight a reality that affects the health, well-being and dignity of too many people throughout our communities. But this crisis didn't emerge overnight. Over the last decade and a half, the action or inaction of the previous government not only failed to address fuel poverty, but made things worse. Nowhere is this failure more evident than in the Conservatives' disastrous record on home insulation and on energy efficiency. In 2013, David Cameron's government infamously decided to cut the green crap, leading to insulation rates falling off a cliff edge and never sufficiently recovering. That reckless decision has cost UK households an estimated £2.5 billion in higher energy bills since then. And when they eventually acknowledged the crisis and promised to upgrade millions of homes, their attempt at intervention were nothing short of chaotic. Take the Green Homes Grant, a scheme launched with a great fanfare in 2020, promising homeowners £1.5 billion in vouchers for insulation and energy-saving improvements. Yet within months, the scheme collapsed in total failure, scrapped after just 6 months, having delivered insulation upgrades to just 10% of homes it was supposed to help. Contractors weren't paid, homeowners were left stranded, and the government wasted millions. Meanwhile, Britain's housing stock remains among the least energy efficient in Europe, with millions of homes leaking heat because of inadequate insulation. The impact of these failings has been stark: higher energy bills, colder homes and increased fuel poverty. As such, it's been great to see this government committed to reversing this damage and committing to bringing energy bills down sustainably and for the long term through the Warm Homes Plan by improving the energy efficiency of our homes. This will not only help tackle fuel poverty, but would also reduce carbon emissions, create green jobs and help us meet our climate targets. Now, I recognise that a significant part of this scheme will be delivered by social landlords, which will avoid many of the issues that were encountered with the previous government's programme. But as I understand it, the boiler upgrade scheme operates on a voucher basis. So it would be good to hear from the Minister in her comments about what the department has learned from the previous government's rushed implementation of the Green Homes Grant and how these issues will be avoided in our plan. The contrast couldn't be clearer. While the Conservatives spent years failing to deliver on their promises, we're getting on with it. We're determined to ensure that no family is forced to live in a freezing home through our investment, regulation and commitment to a fairer, greener future. We can tackle food poverty, we can bring down bills and deliver energy security for the long term.
And Hemsworth for leading the debate. Fuel poverty is huge and has no doubt been emphasised further, especially through the loss of the winter fuel payment for elderly people. I want to commend the Honourable Gentleman. I admire courage, Mr Chairman. I admire the courage of the Honourable Gentleman who had the guts, I could use an R word, but it wouldn't be parliamentary, so I won't use that word, to stand up and vote against that from his side. Well done. We admire you for your courage. We admire you for the stand that you took.
You're here.
I wish to give very quickly, Mr Chairman, in the time allotted, a Northern Ireland perspective to back up the Honourable Gentleman and his stand that he took and others that took in this chamber in relation to it. The Department for Communities back home has defined a household in fuel poverty if it spends some 10% of income on energy costs. It's a substantial section of the population. Others have outlined it very clearly. And fuel poverty rates have fluctuated in Northern Ireland too, with 44% in 2009 and 24% in 2021. I was very fortunate yesterday to have the opportunity to speak in the energy debate held by the Honourable Member for Bath, which highlighted the correlation between the cost of energy and fuel poverty, and it was only an opportunity to highlight that again. The increase in prices have meant that so many are on the breadline, not to mention the devastating impact the loss of the winter fuel payment has had on our elderly generations. I've never had, Mr Chairman, as many elderly people, so many pensioners, so many people who are vulnerable, who have complex health needs, who are battling, I use that word on purpose, it's the right word, battling the loss of their fuel allowance. And I say that with respect to my colleagues on the far side of the chamber, to take that stance and not to support the winter fuel allowance for pensioners was wrong. My request to the Minister, by the way, the Minister, I wish her well in the job that she does. I know she does it with the best of her ability, and we welcome that. Has the Minister had an opportunity to speak to the Department of Communities back home who have responsibility? Although the Honourable Gentleman in his intervention referred to the theme of it starts here at Westminster, of course, but has she had an opportunity to discuss with the relevant Minister? Because back home we've just started.
Poverty in England, you are starting to talk about back home and your constituency. So if you keep your references, because I have English MPs who want to get in on this debate when we're running out of time. So if you can draw your comments to a conclusion.
I'll certainly do the best I can, Mr. Chairman. The issue, no matter what, starts here. Starts in Westminster. It's a fuel poverty debate in England. It's a fuel poverty debate that affects everybody in this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, where the decisions are made in this House, right here, for that decision. So with that in mind, then I would ask the Minister again, would she do me the favour of speaking to the relevant Minister in relation to how we can do it better.
On that point,
I'm very happy to, yeah.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Would he agree that the reform of energy standing charges would be an easy way to cut costs for consumers, especially those living in rural areas, such as my constituency? It seems absurd that daily standing charges can vary so wildly. And would he agree that they're often higher in areas where there's huge energy infrastructure, such as in my constituency?
Yeah, I certainly do. One of the things we can do here in the mainland is look at the issue of poor insulation, poor heating systems needing updated. I know the Minister will look at that and ultimately increase the amount of energy a particular household has to use. Those are some of the things that we can do to help our constituents. Fuel poverty is still a massive issue across the board. There are little signs of it mellowing. We must do more to support our constituents in terms of energy prices and fuel poverty, especially given that there is a huge section of the population struggling with their energy bills. So I look to the Minister for genuinely and kindly for direction. I look to her for support. Because as I am an MP from Strangford in Northern Ireland, representing my people in this chamber on an issue that affects us all across this United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, know something, I want answers as well. Thank you.
Ian Lavery.
Thank you, Mr Everett. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to thank my honourable friend from Normanton and Hemsworth for bringing this timely debate to the chamber. I just want to say, by the way, Mr Everett, fuel poverty didn't start on the 4th of July 2024, for heaven's sake. And I'm not going to take any lectures from anybody who suggests that it is, because let me tell you, under the last 14 years of a Tory government, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of ordinary people died as a result of fuel poverty.
You're in charge now.
So that's the real issue. Of course, the Labour government are now gladly and positively elected, and we look forward to seeing some changes very soon. But what actually is fuel poverty? There's two definitions. There's the new Desnay's definition, and there's the pre-2015 definition. And they're greatly different. And I think the definition, the preferred definition, is used by the government until 2015, and in some parts of the UK still defines fuel poverty as a household that is required to spend 10% of its income to keep itself sufficiently warm. And this definition has advantages that it's linked directly to the cost of energy prices and can still give credit to energy-efficient homes. If a low-income household in a very modern energy-efficient dwelling is still finding and spending 10% of its income on energy, then it's a clear reflection on the impact of the energy price inflation. Very, very important indeed. You cannot really get rid of poverty in this country by rewriting a policy. You cannot do it whether it's fuel poverty, food poverty, child poverty, pensioners poverty. You cannot just get rid of poverty by rewriting policies. There's got to be work done on the ground. But you've got to again look at who suffers from fuel poverty. It's the less well off. It's always the less well off who suffers from fuel poverty and all different types of poverty. In my Blythe and Ashton constituency, according to the House of Commons Library, there's 5,211 households in fuel poverty, and that increases to 4,500 using the pre-2015 definition. And there's more fuel poverty in the east of the constituency, Newbingen by the Sea, and Blythe itself. And it's, again, it's the same, Mr. Speaker, totally and utterly something which the government should be looking at as a matter of urgency. Who suffers because of the fuel energy? The less well off. People in fuel poverty using prepayment electric meters. People, 63% of those in fuel poverty are on some kind of benefit. People, also with regard to the pensioners, the million, probably 2.5 million pensioners suffering as a consequence of fuel poverty. We've got to keep people warm, man. There's lots of things that government can do. Fuel poverty simply means that people aren't warm. We live in the UK, one of the richest nations in the world. How on earth or why on earth are we ensuring that everyone has a safe and warm home to live in? It's called decency. It's called respect. I think it's necessary and extremely important. And I would urge the Minister to consider the points that have been raised this morning with regards to what the government can actually do.
Thank you, Mr. Efford, and I want to congratulate my honourable friend, the Member of Parliament for Normanton and Hemsworth, for securing this important debate. We meet at a time when there's a scourge of fuel poverty across our country. Nearly 20% of households in my Leeds East constituency live in fuel poverty. Over 400,000 people in Yorkshire and the Humber live in fuel poverty. So to say that the fuel poverty strategy needs reviewing is an understatement. It's necessary the government's doing that, and we need real action. Before I get on to the point of the winter fuel payment, we've heard and we're reminded that we live in the 6th richest economy on earth. Let's look at the eye-watering, obscene, unjustified, immoral profits made by some of these energy companies. In total, the energy companies have made, since 2020, £483 billion in profits. As an example, Shell, £88 billion in the last 4 years. BP, £46 billion of profits. E.ON, £33 billion of profits. EDF, £75 billion of profits. Equinor, £134 billion of profits. And the winter fuel payment cuts, which I and others voted against, was estimated to save the government £1.4 billion, and that's before the increased take-up of pensioner credit, and that's before the increased cost of the NHS, where people are cold and need extra medical treatment. So that's the reality that we face. The money is there. And I say that a number of us voted against the winter fuel payment cuts after listening to the voices of our constituents. And I do hope that the government can reconsider this. It wasn't just those that voted against. The concern was far wider than those of us who voted against. And I remember I was only 17 years old when Gordon Brown introduced the winter fuel payment. One of the key achievements of the last Labour government. I would argue the winter fuel payment is also a key part of our welfare state, and I think that's a decision that should be revised and should be reversed as soon as possible, and certainly before next winter. We can call it something else if we like, if that makes it easier. We don't have to call it the winter fuel payments. We can relabel it as something else and reintroduce it. On the wider point, I mentioned the obscene eye-watering profits from these energy companies. The same energy companies, by the way, that have pushed our bills up, but also pushed us towards climate catastrophe. We look at the important issue of retrofitting, which has been mentioned by colleagues. Of course, retrofitting is vitally important, but of course, alone retrofitting is not the answer, because retrofitting will take years. It needs to happen, but alone it's not the answer to fuel profit. We need intervention in the market. We need real price caps. We need action against these energy companies, and we need government support. And so that's why I think this debate is welcome. That's why I welcome the government's review of the fuel poverty strategy. But I would argue that the fuel poverty strategy cannot be sufficient without two things: reintroducing the winter fuel payment and also taking real action on these energy companies who have left people cold, left people frightened, and left too many people in our country living in misery.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Efford. It's an honour to serve under your chairship, and I thank my honourable friend, the member for Normanton and Hemsworth, for securing this hugely important debate, and I've enjoyed the contributions. According to the latest data from the House of Commons Library, almost 1 in 5 people, 17%, are living in fuel poverty in my constituency of Liverpool West Derby. Shocking figures. But that was in 2022, and today will be even higher, because with energy bills up, so are the rates of fuel poverty. National Energy Action estimates that in October 2021, 4.5 million UK households were in fuel poverty. By January of this year, that figure had risen to 6.1 million. For older people, fuel poverty is linked to increased risk of strokes, heart attacks, flu and hypothermia. But for children growing up in cold, damp and mouldy homes, causes higher rates of respiratory infections and asthma. And I speak to my great friend, Dr. Ian Sinner from Alderey Children's Hospital, about the devastating impact of this on children's health. And we will always remember Abu Bashir, who died because of those awful conditions. That is why in September, I voted to oppose the means cessation of the winter fuel allowance. In the run-up to that vote, I received more correspondence from constituents than at any other time in my 5 years as a Member of Parliament. They told me about the devastating impact the cuts would have. Jennifer was terrified about the impact the cut would have on her and her husband's decline in health. Again and again and again, people told me how frightened they were about losing the allowance and the upcoming winter. I was true to my word and I voted on their behalf, but I desperately regret that that cut went ahead and things are set to get worse. Forecasts suggest the energy price cap could be raised by nearly 3% in April. As chair of the all-parliamentary group on motor neurone disease, I have heard firsthand the impact of the cut within the motor neurone disease community, and along with 40 MPs from across Parliament, I signed a letter to the Chancellor about the impact of that cut. Research shows that people living with motor neurone disease spend an estimated £14,500 extra to cope with these conditions. The decision to restrict the winter fuel payment to those receiving means-tested benefits will acutely impact the MND community. Ian Levin, MND sufferer, said, "My bills will increase in the winter because we must keep our bodies warm. This is a real kick in the pants to me because I need everything I can. In my 9 years of motor neurone disease, my expenditure has been approximately £100,000. And Alex Massey from Motor Neurone Disease Association, means testing the winter fuel payment would take no account of the unavoidable costs of living with a highly disabling condition like motor neurone disease. People coping with this devastating condition do not deserve to lose the support they rely on in the winter." And while more people are dragged into fuel poverty, the energy companies, as has been outlined, continue to make a killing. Just yesterday, BP announced record annual profits of £8 billion. 20 energy companies have together made a staggering £483 billion in profits since the start of the energy bill crisis. Sky-high energy bills for our constituents, equal obscene profits for these giant corporations. So, Chair, to conclude, I really welcome the government's review of the fuel poverty strategy. We should be taxing these companies and ending fuel poverty. We introduced the winter fuel allowance as a universal benefit, ensuring nobody falls through the cracks, committing to a social tariff to lower energy bills for low-income households, and ramping up the warm home plan to insulate homes across the country, cutting bills and carbon. I really hope these are in the government's review. Thank you.
So we're bang on time. Thank you very much, everyone. So Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Liz Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr Efford. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I am grateful to the member for Normanton and Hemsworth for bringing forward this important debate. This debate is of vital importance to my constituents in Eastleigh. Fuel poverty has left thousands of people in my constituency and across the country in a terrible situation this winter. Liberal Democrats are gravely concerned that government delays in tackling poorly insulated homes has left thousands of people cold and living in fuel poverty. The UK has the oldest housing stock in Europe and is among the least energy efficient. The previous government failed to commit to a meaningful renewable energy programme or a decent home standard to bring down energy bills, reduce emissions and improve public health. As a result, an estimated 6 million households are in fuel poverty. I have spoken to constituents whose hands are turning blue because they are so afraid to turn on the heating. My constituent Kay wrote to me after discovering that she would lose her winter fuel payment. She told me, "I have had no heating this winter. I suffer from PHPT, which means I cannot work or move around easily. It is so cold in my maisonette that I can see my own breath." Another constituent who also lost the winter fuel payment told me, "I am wrapping myself up in blankets and extra layers. I try to stay out of the house longer so I don't have to turn the heating on. Finding that extra £300 last winter was a lifeline." According to the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero sub-regional fuel poverty data, 7.2% of households in my constituency, amounting to nearly 3,000 families, are living in fuel poverty. Many pensioners are just over the income threshold to receive pension credit, but are still struggling immensely. Constituents have told me that they have resorted to using only a microwave to cook meals because it is cheaper than an oven, while people living in park homes who have told me that they have had to turn off their electric heating entirely, even though their walls, just 2 inches thick, are not properly insulated. According to the Committee on Fuel Poverty, energy efficiency programmes are central to reducing fuel poverty. Liberal Democrats are concerned that the government has delayed both the new Decent Home Standard and the Warm Homes Plan, leaving people without support this winter. Citizens Advice Eastleigh has confirmed that they have seen a massive uptake in energy-related casework amongst low household incomes this year. Their clients are being forced into impossible decisions. With bills expected to rise again in April, I hope the government will do more to protect my constituents and all those in fuel poverty across the UK. I'm deeply concerned about the thousands of pensioners who are still waiting to receive their winter fuel payment, even though they applied on time. So can the Minister please update us on when they will receive their payments? They should not be left struggling through the coldest months due to government delays. The government's own analysis has confirmed that cuts to the winter fuel payment could push 100,000 pensioners in England and Wales into relative fuel poverty. That means 100,000 more people who will struggle to afford heating, more elderly people who will face freezing winters in homes they can't afford to keep warm, and more people suffering preventable illnesses caused by cold and damp conditions. And yet the government is pushing ahead with this mistaken approach that will put so many more people at risk. To truly address this ongoing crisis, the government must be more ambitious. The Honourable Member for South Cambridgeshire tabled an amendment to the GB Energy Bill, which would have ensured the new body facilitates a home insulation programme. The government voted down this amendment. A proper windfall tax on the super profits of oil and gas companies would help fund support for the most vulnerable, rather than allowing energy giants to continue making billions while families suffer. We must also fundamentally reform how energy is priced. Electricity prices should be decoupled from the wholesale gas price to prevent outdated pricing mechanisms from inflating household bills unfairly. This winter, thousands of pensioners and vulnerable families in my constituency are suffering in cold homes and struggling to pay their bills. I urge the Minister to rethink cuts to the winter fuel payment and to introduce meaningful support for those who need it most.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Efford. It's a pleasure to serve under you today, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Normanton and Hemsworth for securing this important debate. I hesitate to compare myself and compete with the Yorkshiremen, but it's been very cold in Suffolk as well recently, and the stories the Honourable Member told of his constituents will be familiar to all of us here today. From the Honourable Member for Liverpool Riverside, who I think is no longer with us, to the Honourable Member for Glastonbury and Somerton, we were reminded that fuel poverty affects urban and rural constituencies alike. The member for North Herefordshire rightly talked of the reliance on heating oil in rural constituencies, and the member for Melksham and Devizes was certainly right to say that pension credit take-up is far too low. As the member for Poole said, we cannot ignore the hardship caused by the government's decision to cut the winter fuel payment so aggressively for millions of pensioners. Of course, there's a case for means testing the payment, but the Chancellor is cutting it, not just for the richest pensioners, but for those on very modest incomes. And if the winter fuel payment is to be means tested, surely the proceeds should go towards low-income pensioners and the cost of social care. But they're not, because we know Labour's spending priorities. It's to throw money they're taking from pensioners to the public sector and railway unions that funded them. Let us remember, during the election campaign, Labour repeatedly promised us that they would protect the winter fuel payment. But we know the Chancellor planned the cut all along, because she said she wanted to do this as far back as 2014. And let us be clear, as my honourable friend, the member for Keighley and Ilkley said, the policy is a political choice, not, as ministers claim, an economic necessity. The Office for Budget Responsibility has blown up the government's claim that it inherited a fiscal hole. Of the report used by ministers to justify this claim, Richard Hughes, the OBR chairman, said, quotes, "Nothing in our review was a legitimisation of that claim." And indeed, the minister with us today must answer this simple question. If the cuts for pensioners and the tax rises were made necessary by fiscal prudence, why did Labour promise in their manifesto to increase spending by £9.5 billion a year by 2028-29, only to actually increase it in their budget by £76 billion? This was a choice. But of course, the challenge of fuel poverty affects people of all ages and across the country. Rather than creating new benefits and schemes to address the high cost of fuel, we need also to resolve the root causes of energy costs more generally. And here the government is taking the country in a very worrying direction. The Energy Secretary promises to decarbonise the grid by 2030. The Business Secretary wants to ban petrol and diesel cars by the same year. Tough standards on aviation fuel are being enforced. Heat pumps are expected to replace gas boilers. Expensive and intermittent renewable technologies funded with huge and hidden subsidies are favoured. Oil and gas fields in the North Sea are abandoned, left for the Norwegians to profit from what we choose to ignore. The Energy Secretary has made much of the NISO report on decarbonising the grid. He says it shows that he can do that by 2030 without increasing bills. But in fact, the report doesn't say that. And even then, its calculations rest on a carbon price that will rise to £147 per tonne of CO2. No wonder, in reply to a question I asked him last week, the Energy Secretary wouldn't rule out having a higher carbon price in Britain than in Europe. This will be terrible for families struggling with the cost of heating their homes, but it will hurt them and indeed all of us in other ways. As long as policy runs faster than technology and other countries do not follow our lead on climate change, decarbonisation will inevitably mean deindustrialisation. And that will mean a weaker economy with lower growth, fewer jobs and less spending power to help those we've been discussing today who need support the most. And of course, it's not just the NISO report that shows us the future consequences of the government's policies. The OBR says environmental levies will reach up to £15 billion by the end of this Parliament to pay for net zero policies. As this will fall heavily on consumption, it will have a particularly regressive effect. Analysis from the Institute for Fiscal Studies and from Cornwall Insight confirmed this fact. No wonder, then, that the Labour election promise to cut bills by £300 by the end of the Parliament has vanished without trace. So I challenge the Minister today to do what she hasn't done since polling day and repeat that promise very clearly. I suspect she won't, because unlike the Secretary of State, she knows the reality of his policies. The government is adding complexity and contradiction to our energy system. It's loading extra costs onto families across the country. There is still time for ministers to think again and put the interests of decent, hard-working people ahead of the Energy Secretary's ideological dogma.
Thank you, Chair. I want to start by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Normanton and Hemsworth, for securing this really important debate today. I know that my honourable friend has a great record of speaking up for low-income and vulnerable families, both in his constituency and across the country. And let me say this, I share his desire to tackle fuel poverty. I share his anger that the reality for too many people in this country is that energy is simply unaffordable. And this government is determined to take the action that is necessary to both lower bills and support the most vulnerable in our society. I would also like to thank all members for their contribution to this debate. Thank you to members for highlighting the heartbreaking stories that I know are happening across the country of families that are struggling. I will give way.
But she said about the heartbreaking stories. My honourable friend from West Derby and I have just come off the picket lines at PCS outside a government department. And one of the issues that have been raised with us in those picket lines is the cost of living, particularly fuel poverty, because these are workers on low wages who are experiencing poverty. And one of the things that each minister could do now is go back to their department and basically review all the contracts and end the outsourcing and bring those workers back into an in-source service.
Thank you to my honourable friend. Look, we know that there is a challenge with the cost of living. We are coming out of the worst cost of living crisis that we have faced in a generation. And both within my department but across government, tackling that challenge is central to what we are trying to do. Look, it's really important that we locate this debate in the context that we find ourselves. We published a review of our fuel poverty strategy last week, and the headline was staggering. Fuel poverty has stagnated in this country. It stagnated under the last government. In 2023, an estimated 13% of households, 3.17 million people in England were in fuel poverty under the low-income, low-energy efficiency metric, which is a narrow statutory definition. We know that out there in the country, a lot more people are feeling the pressure of energy bill, are feeling that sense that they cannot cope and they cannot afford to heat their homes. In 2023, of all low-income households in England, about 46% lived in properties with an energy efficiency rating of band D or lower. And this creates a cycle that is difficult to escape, where we have the poorest in our country living in cold homes. And behind these statistics are lives. People scared, and I've heard the stories direct, scared to turn on the heat because they're scared of that bill at the end of the month. Parents having to make that impossible choice between feeding their kids and heating their homes. And what I would say is that the reality is intolerable for too many people. We know it is intolerable for too many people. That is the legacy of the last government. That is the legacy that we have inherited, but it is a legacy that we are determined to turn around. Every family and business in the country has paid the price of our dependence on global fossil fuel markets that we do not control. We have inherited sky-high energy bills. Yes, they are down from the crisis peak, but they are still at record highs. And we see our clean power mission, rather than being ideological, as a primary solution to this problem. And the reason why we are running to deliver clean power at the speed and the pace that we are is that we see this as our route to delivering homegrown energy that we have more control over, that will deliver energy security for the country, and critically will take us off this roller coaster of price rises and price hikes that we know are impacting families, and deliver the financial security that I know families across the country are desperate for. But we recognise that whilst we do that, we also need to reform the electricity market. And the review of electricity market arrangements that we are working on at the moment is looking at this very question of how we decouple gas from clean power prices. And our judgment is that as we increase the amount of clean power in the system, we will do the job of that decoupling alongside market reforms so that people can benefit from the big changes that we're trying to make. But I will say this, we recognise that we also have to support families who are struggling whilst we make this transition. I will give way.
Thank the Minister for allowing an intervention. Would the Minister acknowledge that, as I made reference in my speech, that 64,000 pensioners, many of those who are really, really struggling right now to make that difficult choice between either putting food on the table or heating their homes? I made references in my speech to do with those concerns that have been raised, and she's rightly acknowledged that. But does she does the Minister recognise that the choice in which she and her government made to remove the winter fuel allowance payment was the wrong choice to have made when so many pensioners are in such a dire state as a result of the choice that this government has made?
The honourable member raises the winter fuel payments. The members across the House have raised the winter fuel payment. The Chancellor had an impossible job to do and made a tough call. But we have been very, very clear that we will do whatever we need to make sure that we are supporting the most vulnerable. And everything I am charged with doing, everything my department is trying to do, is to make sure that households that we know are struggling with bills can be protected and insulated from that. The reason why the government has reviewed the fuel poverty strategy, sustainable, warm, protecting vulnerable households, is that we recognise that the trajectory we were on was not the right trajectory. Through the review, we've seen that actually progress on meeting that statutory target has stalled. But alongside this review, we are now consulting on how we up our strategy in order to respond to that problem. I will give way.
Mr. Minister, in questions on UQs and statements in the Chamber in this House, has been very keen to ensure that every part of this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland can benefit from the strategies in this House, that it goes out and the ripples go out to everywhere. I know that in my contribution I asked the Minister again, would there be an opportunity to discuss that with the relevant Minister back home? The Minister I know is committed to that. Can I ask the Minister, would she update me please on where those talks have went and discussions have went, so we can all benefit? Thank you.
In relation to England.
Yes, in relation to let me reassure the honourable member that we are talking to all devolved administration. There are common challenges that we're all facing. There are common solutions, and so we are working in collaboration. We have an interministerial working group, and I am having direct conversations with all devolved administration as we take forward our plans. But look, I should also say that we are also trying to work with everyone. The challenge that we're facing to turn around the trajectory on fuel poverty is a huge one. The inheritance is a tough one, and so we want to draw on the expertise of consumer groups, of industry, of academia as we develop our plan on fuel poverty. I will give way.
For giving way, and she talks about the tough job that the Chancellor has. Will she acknowledge that the job is tough because of her own choices? She talks about the inheritance, but actually, as I said in my speech, the Labour manifesto said that Labour would increase spending by £9.5 billion a year. The budget increased it by £76 billion a year. That's the reason why the Chancellor faces tough decisions. It all originates with her own political choice. Will she acknowledge that?
I mean, I do think that it's pretty audacious of the honourable member, given the record of the last government, given the financial position that the last government, given the wrecking ball that the last government placed on this economy. Now, we are having to clean up the mess of the last government, and yes, we've had to make tough choices before that, but I think there is an audaciousness, candidly, if I was in the position of the honourable member, I would be hanging my head in shame rather than trying to lecture us on how we clean up the mess that they have created. Look, but what I will say is, whether it is on the issue of the economy, whether it is on the issue of the fuel poverty, we understand that we have been given an atrocious inheritance. We are not complacent with that. Things that the other side were willing to accept, we are not willing to accept. I will make progress, which is why on the critical issue of fuel poverty, we are consulting in order to improve our strategy. And we're looking at the question of both how we make progress on our statutory target for 2030, but also asking ourselves the question about wider affordability and what measures of that, so that we can make sure that as we're taking action in government, it is both dealing with our statutory obligation, but critically dealing with the more fundamental problem of affordability that we see across the country. We, alongside our consultation on the fuel poverty strategy, we have also taken steps to try to lift 500,000 people out of fuel poverty through improving standards in the private rented sector. So last week we published a consultation which would increase minimum energy efficiency standards in the domestic private rented sector by 2030. Our proposals will require landlords, in order to upgrade their homes so that tenants can benefit from warmer homes through insulation, cavity wall insulation, double glazing first, and then through other measures like solar, batteries, smart meters, in order to benefit from warmer homes. The honourable member asked the question about the impact on renters. I would say two things. Our analysis suggested if we get this right, we could be saving renters about £240. And we know that there is a risk, potentially, of landlords hiking bills. Now, what I would say is, both based on the evidence of when we have upgraded homes in the past, what we have found is landlords have not increased bills, so we don't expect them to increase bills this time again. But critically, we have been surveying landlords, and the feedback that we've got is that the majority of them would cover the cost of these upgrades that they know are the right things to do. And I should add that 50% of landlords are already have already upgraded their homes up to EPC C, so they will pay for that through their savings. So we are confident that renters will not be penalised, and the measures that have been coming through the Renters Reform Bill, we believe will provide enough safeguards so that renters can benefit from £240 off their energy bills, but also the security of knowing that their rents will not be increased. I will give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way, but would the Minister also recognise that indeed many landlords are actually not in a sound financial position themselves, and when therefore challenged, when they do have property to be able to rent out, to get the energy performance rating up to C, can be incredibly costly to do so, and it actually sometimes unachievable based on sometimes a whole old housing stock. So could the Minister just outline what support would be available for the upgrade to get to energy performance rating of C, in which this is the government's ambition?
So we have estimated that the average cost of upgrading homes that are not at C is about £6,000. In order to protect landlords, we have put in place a maximum cap of £15,000. And we've also created the mechanisms to have exemptions for those landlords that we know will generally struggle with this. But alongside that, we are already providing support through our boiler upgrade schemes. We're providing support through our Warm Homes local grant that landlords can access. And as we set out our policies within the Warm Homes plan, we'll be setting out more measures that can support landlords go on this journey. And I should say the vast majority of landlords want to do this. 50% have already done that. We need to level the playing field for renters so that all landlords are delivering homes that are of a standard that will make sure that tenants have homes that are warmer and homes that are cheaper to run. But look, I would say that alongside what we're trying to do on minimum energy efficiency standards in the rental sector, a big plank of what we know we need to do to tackle fuel poverty will be through our Warm Homes plan. This plan will transform homes across the country in order to make them cheaper and warmer. It's a very simple idea behind this. It will mean upgrading homes with insulation, with solar, with heat pumps. And what I would say to the points that have been made about delays, in rolling out the warm home plans. We are running at this. So this year alone, we have massively increased the number of upgrades that we are expecting to £300,000, to 300,000, backed by £3.2 billion worth of investment. We will come forward in the spring with our plans to ramp up this, and the key thing that we are trying to achieve is how we move from hundreds of thousands of upgrades that we have seen, how we move from the inheritance where the last government, quite frankly, slashed home upgrades, despite us knowing that this has a huge impact on both bills and the comfort of consumers, in order to get to the millions of homes. And that means taking a comprehensive view that will look at how we increase demand for home upgrades, how we do the job of making sure that we are delivering at scale in places, working with regional government, working with suppliers, but critically how we make sure that when people do go on this journey of upgrading their homes, they have the confidence of knowing that it will be quality work that is done, to the point that was made by my honourable friend, but critically that they know that it will be of a standard, and that they know that if things do go wrong, that there will be redress and protection. Because what we have seen is that the current system that we inherited was far too fragmented, that it's far too ad hoc. Consumers are not at the heart of the system, and we absolutely must turn that around.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and I thank her very much for her comments so far. And specifically on that point of the tackling the fragmentation and the ad hocery of the previous systems, would the Minister agree with me that home insulation upgrades is a win-win-win policy? It's good for people's warmth and health, it's really good for jobs, and by the way, it helps save the climate as well. And that one of the really key barriers to that in recent years has been the stop-start year-on-year type policy, which means that nobody in the supply chain is able to plan and have that kind of strategic direction that they need to make the investments, to build the labour force and so forth. Will the government provide that long-term certainty about policy direction here and the level of investment required, so that everybody can pull together in the same direction?
Thank you to the honourable member. I absolutely agree that home insulation are a core part of how we tackle the problem with fuel poverty. Unless we can have homes that are insulated, whatever energy, at whatever price we put into people's homes, are going out of their windows. So this is why it is so important to what we're trying to do through the Warm Homes Plan. And what we are seeking to do with the plan is to provide that long-term certainty. Long-term certainty for consumers, so that they know that there is a programme in which will support them through a journey, but critically for the supply chain. And I've heard and I've spoken to lots of installers that tell me they're eating hand to mouth. The ability to build and plan and recruit apprenticeships and build up their capacity is constrained by the stop-start approach. So we are very, very clear that the plan needs to be a long-term plan, and we are working to make sure that we can underpin that with long-term certainty on funding, so that we can see the level of ramp-up and scale-up we need, so that we are trying to insulate and we're trying to upgrade millions of homes rather than hundreds of thousands of homes.
Order. Could I just say that I'd like to bring in the mover of the motion with a couple of minutes at the end.
Yes.
Just so, thank you, Minister.
And let me address the points that were made by members from rural constituency. We are clear that this plan has got to work for every part of the country, and that we have to have solutions for every house. So rather than government dictating the solutions, but from on high in Whitehall, we need to make sure that we're empowering the system to figure out the best way in which we can deliver homes that are warm for people across the country. And that does mean thinking about the range and mix of solutions that can go into people's homes, so they can have low carbon options, but also options that work for their pockets. But alongside what we need to do through our Warm Homes Plan, it's important for me to say that we've also got to deal with the question of supporting households and bill support. This is why, going into this winter, and to that point of us wanting to do everything we can to support the most vulnerable, I worked with energy suppliers to get them to commit to £500 million of industry support for people this winter, so that we can get help to households that we know are struggling. Alongside, the government has extended the Household Support Fund until the 31st of March 2026, with an extra £752 million. We are providing the cold weather payment, and alongside alongside that, our department are providing the warm homes discount, which is going to over 3 million households. And what I would say is that the warm homes discount regulation expires in 2026. And so we want to consider the options for the future. Members talked about a social tariff. The challenge with the social tariff, which we're hearing across the piece, is that it means different things to different people. But we are looking at all the options in order to make sure that we can provide the support that people need. And look, let me conclude by saying this. I understand the passion that I've heard from members. I share that passion and commitment. I think the reality, the energy, something that is not a luxury good. It is not a nice to have. It is absolutely foundational for people. It's out of control for people. It's out of reach for people. I think that is a shame. I think that is a stain on us. But it is a shame and stain that we are determined to turn around.
Thank you, Chair. 1 minute.
Thank you very much.
No
In the
hesitation.
1 minute I've got, let me thank everybody for contributing. I think the House will have heard the Minister's passion and commitment. And particularly I was interested in what she said about warm homes. And she said too that she had heartbreaking stories and she was determined to drive down fuel poverty. But I'm afraid, though much was good in what she said, there is elements missing. And the truth is, if you look at our society, it is deeply dysfunctional. It needs structural change and a rupture with existing arrangements. And on energy, the fact that billions of pounds are made by profit while millions of people are left in poverty leads me to one conclusion, which is this, that let the people who drive people into poverty by driving up the prices pay for the fact that so many people are in poverty whilst we get on with retrofitting the houses. Thank you very much.
Order, order. The debate is concluded. You can all, if you could leave quietly so that I can call the next speaker.